Today we are reading The Beast of Buckingham Palace by David Williams. I'm going to introduce some of the main characters before we start the story. Prince Alfred is simply boy 12 who has never known life outside of Buckingham Palace. The Lord Protector is a learned man who began his royal career 40 years ago in the palace library. He has risen to become the king's closest advisor, but yearns for more power. Nanny is a lady in her 80s who, in her job, has looked after 2 generations of royal children. She cared for the king when he was a boy and is now a nanny to Prince Alfred. Let's get started with the story. Chapter 1, Dark. It was noon and the sky was black. There has been darkness over the kingdom for half a century. For many years before, the people of the earth had not taken care of their home. They had burned down all the forests, reducing every last tree to ash. They had pumped the rivers, lakes, and seas full of waste, killing all the fish. They had dug deeper and deeper under the ground for oil, until the planet was hollow to its core. Eventually, the earth took its revenge. The ice caps of the Arctic and Antarctic melted. The floods were so mighty that whole countries became submerged underwater. Violent earthquakes shook entire cities to the ground. All that was left behind were piles and piles of rubbish. Volcanoes erupted, pumping billions of tons of ash into the air. Without the sunlight, the crops withered and died. Nothing could grow. The kingdom was plunged into an eternal winter. It was the only world Alfred knew. He was already 12 years old, but had never, ever seen sunlight. Often he dreamed how it must have been to feel the sun on your face, or run through a field of tall grass, or swim in a sunlight sea. But it was just that, a dream. The boy had seen pictures of the sun in books, and marveled at it, a perfect circle of gold. Now the moon had stars and had become invisible too. Alfred would spend hours and hours imagining how the night sky must have looked with 1,000 little lights twinkling through the blackness. He was one of those children who liked nothing more than being alone with his imagination. In truth, he had little choice, having been sickly his whole life. Soon after he was born, he became ill. As a baby, Alfred had not been expected to survive, but survive he did. Just. The child was as pale as snow and as thin as dust. He wore thick glasses to aid his poor eyesight. Often, Alfred was so weak he had to stay in bed all day. Thank goodness all around his bed were piles and piles of books. Books, books, and more books. Books about animals, books about space, books about trees, books about dinosaurs, books about books. Books about history were his absolute favorite. The trouble was that there was a strict curfew in the building where Alfred lived. Night was the most dangerous time. That was when the most chance of an attack from the outside came. Lights had to be put out at 8 o'clock sharp by order of the king. Anyone caught with lights on would be severely punished. Punishments were brutal in the kingdom. Those in power had returned to medieval forms of torture. Thumbscrews, the Iron Maiden, the breaking wheel, the pillory, the rack, the scold's bridle, the rat's dungeon, the head crusher, the iron chair. Despite the strict rules, the boy loved his books so much he would carry on reading by candlelight under the bed covers. This night our story begins. Alfred was doing just that. He was reading a weighty leather-bound book about the kings and queens of Britain through the ages. The first known one was Alfred the Great. He had become ruler an impossibly long time ago in 871. The boy was named after the first king, but it was hard to believe anybody would ever describe Alfred as great. He felt anything but. As the boy was devouring his story of the beheading of King Charles I in 1649, a deafening sound rocked the room. Kaboom! Alfred dropped his book. Thud! And his candle. Woof! Smothering the flames and blowing the candle out. Whoosh! He pulled off his bed covers. A huge explosion outside had illuminated the boy's bedroom with glowing red, orange, and yellow light. Alfred slid out of bed and, using all his strength, limped over to his huge bay window. Just those few steps left him painfully out of breath. He leaned on the window to steady himself. Alfred's bedroom was high up on the top floor. From here, he could see far across London. A building was ablaze, but not just any building, St. Paul's Cathedral. This historic structure, perhaps one of the most famous in the world, had been destroyed. Dun, dun,